Today on Across the Fence, the call of the loon is a call to action. We're going to learn about the birds, the scientists, and the volunteers involved in Vermont's Loon Conservation Project. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for choosing Across the Fence. I'm Will Michael in this afternoon for Judy Simpson. Few birds evoke the wild yet pleasing sensation that comes from hearing and seeing a common loon. Loons are iconic symbols of our northern lakes and ponds, but they're particularly vulnerable to nest disturbance, as well as toxicity from lead sinkers and mercury. And that's where Vermont's Loon Conservation Project comes in. The project is led by the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and its chief partner, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. As Rebecca Gollan shows us, the Loon Conservation Project is securing a future for loons in our state.
Right now we're hearing a bird here. It's a spotted sandpiper. A lot of birding we do by ear.
The call of a loon is unmistakable. It's very familiar to anyone who visits Vermont's larger lakes.
You become so used to them, and listening to them, you can tell the difference in their call, and they have quite a personality.
Linda and Bob Tucker spend a lot of their time on the water. The Ludlow couple are avid kayakers and regularly visit a number of the lakes in southern and central Vermont. They enjoy the exercise, but are usually paddling with a purpose.
He's actually the loon ranger, and I'm his assistant. So yes, I go when I'm needed to different places, and he gets me into positions that are really strange, like swimming across the lake to get an egg out of a nest because he can't get close enough with the kayak. You know, that sort of thing is my job.
The Tuckers were recruited by friends to volunteer for the Vermont Loon Conservation Project about 20 years ago.
We had seen loons, heard loons, as we ran around Lake Echo in Vermont. We didn't really know what, we were always asking, what is that? And finally we saw some.
Loons return to Vermont from the New England coast at the end of winter. They start nesting from May to mid-June. The birds are easy to find and watch because of their distinctive black and white coloring, and because they spend most of their time on the water.
And we watch them through the summer until they learn to fly, and right up until they leave just before ice. I've been out when there's ice around Lake Nineveh and out there with them, and the little ones are still there. The parents have left. The little ones leave at the end, just before ice sets in. They seem to know because it's only a couple days and there's ice. So I've watched them from the beginning to the end.
When the Tuckers got involved in the project, the loon population in the state was facing a crisis.
They were put on the state endangered species list. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, they were trying to figure out, okay, where's the bigger problem? We put out these nest warning signs to attempt to try to give this island a little bit of space where the loons would nest.
Eric Hansen knows loons.
Takes about a month of incubation. Both male and female share in everything, whether it's nesting, chick rearing, feeding the chick, doing everything. Their behaviors are pretty much identical as far as amount of time spent. When the chicks hatch, they can actually swim within hours. They leave the nest right away. They're done with the nest, pretty much for the rest of the summer. That chick may not touch land until it breeds, which on average is a 7-year-old loon. So 7 years of just being on the water or in the air.
Hansen is the project coordinator for the Vermont Loon Conservation Project, which is part of the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, or VCE. The effort started in the late 1970s when scientists realized that the number of loons nesting in the state had dropped dramatically.
So in 1983, there were only 7 pairs that nested in the entire state, and maybe another 5 pairs that were around, and they only counted 29 adult loons that year, going statewide to most of the larger lakes. And they realized that, there's something going on. So in 1987, they were put on the state endangered species list.
At that time, scientists took a look at the remaining loons and their habitats to figure out what had caused the drastic decline and what could be done to turn it around. One piece of the puzzle was identifying certain types of lead fishing lures as poisonous to the birds and getting those banned. Another important piece was to protect the areas where loons build their nests.
And one of the bigger issues that came up, or obvious issues, especially one that we could have an effect, was at the nesting site. They're very prone to disturbance. They don't walk on land, so if something comes near them, they want to get into the water. They feel safe in the water, but they don't really feel safe sitting there, whether that's a human on shore, whether it's a boater. So trying to protect some of the sites that are on busier lakes. Another place was places like this, reservoirs that go up and down with hydro operation. Is there anything hydro companies could do to stabilize water? Loons are only nesting, just an inch to 4 or 5 inches off the water, somewhere in there. Sometimes it can be a foot, but it doesn't take much for water to go up and flood a nest.
On islands where the birds just can't seem to get a purchase, a successful purchase for whatever reason, we'll use artificial islands. We call them platforms or rafts, which are just really cedar logs with a wire mesh, and we vegetate them, and the loons will use those for nesting. And those are great because they float up and down with the water.
VCE Executive Director Chris Rimmer says that the expanding loon population can lead to issues that are both good and bad.
As the population increases, which it is annually now, there are more and more loons coming back looking for new territories, looking for mates, and some of these birds are actually creating problems for the existing pairs. So a male, for instance, might come into a territory of an existing pair and try to evict the resident male, and there can be some really severe skirmishes. I would call them battles. Now, it's a good sign because it means there's a lot of loons and we've done well and they're increasing, but we've seen some territorial takeovers. We've also seen some battles that have resulted in injury and even in 1 or 2 cases death of one of the 2 loons that was fighting. There aren't unlimited available territories for loons, so the birds are competing for the few vacancies that remain. It wasn't a problem we had to think about 20 years ago.
Scientists with the VCE say that a thriving loon population needs clean lakes, healthy shorelines, and a good food base. And all of those things are present here in Vermont. Over 80 pairs of loons have attempted to nest in recent years. But that is not enough to ensure long-term success. Along with the increase in the loon population is an increase in their interactions with humans.
We've done our job. The loons are back. We've changed our name. We're now the Vermont Loon Conservation Project. We're no longer the Vermont Loon Recovery Project. So that always begs the question, are we ready to pack up and leave and move on? For some species, you can do that with. For loons, though, their habitat overlaps almost entirely with our recreational habitat. Where we like to boat, where we like to picnic. And so there's always this sort of conflict, or potential for conflict. They're on reservoirs that are going to go up and down. So for at least half of our sites out there in the state, we're going to need some sort of management, whether it's nest warning signs or whether it's the rafts, or at least keeping tabs on them a little more closely.
The group currently has placed a number of signs on lakes around the state, indicating loon nesting areas and asking people not to disturb them. Raising awareness has also raised a sense of protectiveness in many places.
This pond is pretty well utilized by a lot of fishermen. There's a fisherman just coming in here. And yet these loon have been able to bring off youngsters over several years. And although it's a small pond and lots of people fishing here, it's amazing that with these signs that they put up, people, they basically feel that they need to protect these birds. And so I've never seen harassment, and the loons have been successful.
The Vermont Loon Conservation Project continues to get calls about loons in distress or stuck on lakes or ponds that aren't big enough for them. Despite that, the species as a whole is thriving in Vermont.
Loons are special just because they're so easy to become part of our lives.
Protecting a special bird and preserving Vermont's natural environment for generations to come. In Killington, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Joining me now are two major players in the Loon Conservation Project. I want to welcome Eric Hansen, who's the project's director, the lead biologist with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us. And John Buck is a longtime wildlife biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. Gentlemen, thank you both for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Eric, I'm going to start quickly just to follow up on the video that we just saw. What type of fishing tackle or fishing equipment is a problem when it relates to loons?
It's pretty much the lead sinkers that are attached to the line, and also lead jigs. And in Vermont, there's some laws about the lead sinkers, half ounce or less. There is no law about jigs, but we're still educating people to try to remove lead from their tackle box, just because it's not only loons but lots of other species that can get affected and poisoned by it.
What are some of the other conservation concerns or challenges facing the loons? We've touched on lead, and we've made a lot of progress there with law and with awareness, but there are other issues that remain.
Well, associated with the lead would be just monofilament from fishing gear. Loons will take live bait and lures, so we really try to ask folks to reel in. If the loons are coming in near your boat, pause for a few minutes, see where they go, boat down to the next cove, something like that. Because every year I have to go chase around birds that are caught up with the line. Sometimes we can rescue them, sometimes we can't. I actually just had 2 sightings last week of birds that I banded from those rescues. They'd actually ingested the line right down their throat. We snipped it free, let them go, and this is 2-3 years later now we're seeing those birds. So it can work to save them. Doesn't always happen that way. And another, I think, really neat aspect of the loon is that it's a real symbol and an indicator of our health of our lakes. And mercury is one of the ones we're following. We did some intensive sampling back 2000, 2001 here in Vermont, where we took blood and feather samples just to get an idea of what's going on in mercury in our lakes, and loons being kind of at the top of the food chain. So it's shows that overall Vermont was doing okay, a lot because of our soil chemistry and all of, gets into the nitty-gritty there. But in other parts in Maine and Nova Scotia, we're actually seeing losses of chick productivity upward of 40%, because mercury is a neurotoxin. It doesn't kill the loon, but it affects the behavior.
You and I talked before the program. This is like the canary in the coal mine, because while mercury is the big one, you even talked about fire retardant chemicals showing up in some autopsies and types of things.
Yeah, there's been some other sampling just to kind of see what are we finding in the birds, and we're seeing flame retardants to pesticides, and saying where are these coming from? And so again, the loons are just kind of at the top of that food chain. They kind of see what's going on. Not always lethal, but we're definitely something we're going to be watching over decades and all the way across the country, which is a neat thing to be able to use this bird for. And we still do mercury sampling, and one of those is by taking eggs that don't hatch, and Linda Tucker mentioned that in the video. We definitely don't want people going out to the nests and doing anything close, but when we have an abandoned nest or chick hatches but one egg doesn't hatch, I'll work with the volunteers very closely and safely to make sure that we can get that egg and get it to the laboratory.
Because that yields excellent research results. That tells you a lot.
And it's opportunistic. It's very easy to get that type of sample versus going to actually intensively go out and try to catch a bird, which is risky in its own right.
John Buck, we saw scientists and volunteers in Becky's video. Who are the big players in this project? How does it work?
Well, it involves a tremendous number of people and organizations, and Eric carries the lion's share of all this work and his army of volunteers. The restoration couldn't have happened without all of that. But there are side players as well, our law enforcement staff and Fish and Wildlife, and the biologists here at Fish and Wildlife. And the VINS Rehab Center has been really crucial in helping those loons that we've been able to rehabilitate and release back in the wild, those that have been caught in the fishing line or have been ill for some reason or other, or injured, and then been able to be restored to the wild.
We have just about 90 seconds or less here, and I have some notes here on loons through the seasons, John. Summertime in particular, what do paddlers, general public, what do we need to be aware of, gentlemen, height of the summer, June, July, August? Because it's my understanding that's really the critical time here in Vermont. Is that fair?
Sure, it is. Because the chicks are still young, they haven't fledged yet, they don't know how to fly, they're with their parents. And we have the greatest, I think, human intensity use on the water at this time of year. Various boating and swimming activities, and people love loons, and it's easy to understand why. They want to get close and get a better picture, or just want to be really, really close to see this magnificent bird. And we would ask, please keep a respectful distance. Observe the loon's behavior. If they look upset, that means they are, and just back away, stay away. Observe them from a distance with a long distance photo lens or binoculars or something.
That's a great way to end today's program because it's just so important. Again, I want to thank both of you for coming in. We want to share quickly that for more information on the Loon Conservation Project through the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, you can see the website there on your screen. Lots of information. You can also call 802-649-1431. That is our program for today. We know you have choices, so thanks for choosing us. I'm Will Michael, inviting you to join us back here each weekday afternoon for another visit Across the Fence.